All right. Well, folks, thanks so much for coming this morning. I'm Jens Hilke, a conservation planner with Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. I'm going to do this first section of the webinar this morning, and then Danielle Owczarski is going to take over. She's a watershed planner with DEC, and she'll do a section on looking at the river corridor more from that watershed perspective. And then Staci Pomeroy, a river scientist, also with Department of Environmental Conservation, will do the last segment. So thank you all for joining us this morning. You passed your first test, which was getting through the Microsoft Teams headache. I'm sure you've all noticed by now the toolbar on Teams has both a video button and a microphone button. Please go ahead and mute your mics for the duration of the webinar. We also have a chat function. And so if you open that chat function, that would be great. And that's going to be a way that we're going to communicate with you over the course of the webinar. So we'll offer some links in the chat and share those with you. If you could go ahead and just introduce yourselves by saying your name and what town you're from and putting that in the chat, that would be a really helpful way for us to know who all is here. Now we're going to divide this up into 3 sections, as I said. In between each section, we're going to pause and answer questions that have come in on the chat during that section. So again, feel free to use the chat to write those questions during the presentation, and we'll address those questions at the end of each of the 3 sections. Now, I had told you a little bit about how this is going to be divided up. I'm going to begin by talking about the river corridor in the context of Vermont conservation design and looking at surface waters and riparian areas. Danielle is going to be addressing this section on basin planning and the watershed scale and how we work with towns. And then Staci will take that last section of the river corridor, thinking about concepts like fluvial erosion, protection, and pools. Before we get too far along, I just need to tell you a little bit about where I'm coming from, and the host of this series is the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. And we believe in the conservation of our fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats for the people of Vermont. It's a huge mission. It takes us in a variety of different directions, working with different constituencies. My job is to coordinate the community wildlife program. And we provide technical assistance to all Vermont municipalities, planning commissions, conservation commissions, DRBs. We do work interpreting natural resources through presentations and workshops. We help in the planning process. We offer resources, and we'll share some of those with you at the end. So we are here available to you for that kind of technical assistance. And Danielle and Staci can tell you more about their interactions and how they offer services to the public. So, and when I think about the river corridor, one of the principal ways that I bring this into the work that I do is through Vermont conservation design. And here is a selection of forest blocks and the river system that are most important for ecological function into the future. And so when I work with municipalities, I talk a lot about this system needing to be intact, connected, and diverse. And so those forest blocks need to be whole, as big as possible. They need to be connected to one another, and they need to be biologically diverse. And really the same is true of our aquatic network. And so Vermont conservation design brings these concepts together, the aquatic and the terrestrial priorities, into one place. And that's the type of data that I work with and provide to towns. Now, all of that data is available to you on the BioFinder website, and we'll post that URL in the chat. But BioFinder is a great way to interact with the Vermont conservation design data and see how those surface waters and those forest blocks feed off one another to make this larger ecological pattern. Now, when we do this network, this design, this functional landscape, when we do this well, we get other benefits beyond the ecological. And so those are going to include not just biological diversity, but benefits for outdoor recreation, clean water, rural character, working farms, and other benefits like ecosystem services. So there's this whole range of benefits, both ecological and cultural, that we get from having this intact, connected, and diverse network, this mix of terrestrial and aquatic priorities. So specifically within Vermont conservation design, we have several different components that we use to highlight different parts of the ecological world. And I'm going to show you these as separate entities, but I just want to be absolutely clear about how important it is that they interact with one another. The design, conservation design, was built with the interaction of these different components as a core function of how we developed it. But let me just tell you a little bit more about what I'm talking about here. So we have this selection of forest blocks for interior forest value. So these are the deep, dark woods. And then we have a selection of forest blocks that are connected. There is a pattern here, a connected pattern of these forest blocks from north to south, from east to west. They connect places of biological diversity. It uses this concept of connectivity, uses that surface water network as an incredibly important piece of knitting together these forest blocks. So this layer that I'm showing you is of forest blocks, but in selecting those blocks, we use the riparian network to make this selection. And so here's that whole surface water and riparian area network. Anything that's wet in Vermont, rivers, streams, lakes, ponds, wetlands, all show up in Vermont conservation design and really at that highest priority standard, thinking about biological diversity. Then the last piece here in Vermont conservation design is this concept of physical landscapes. And that really gets into this idea of a resilient landscape, one that's able to withstand change. And places that are diverse in the physical landscape are going to be better able to withstand change, climate change into the future. And so that's how we bring in those concepts of resiliency into this network. The last one here is just a reminder for me to talk about wildlife road crossings. And while that is not exactly a landscape scale priority, it certainly feeds into this landscape scale network. And we'll talk a little bit more in a couple slides about how those concepts interact, of where wildlife are crossing and this river corridor, the surface water and riparian area network. So I had told you that that we did this selection of habitat blocks using the riparian landscape. And I just wanted to illustrate this in maps and show you this area up here by the Missisquoi. And how these blocks show up as highest priority forest and wetland blocks from that Vermont conservation design statewide perspective. And so you can see the dark orange, those highest priority connectivity blocks, and then the brown, those priority connectivity blocks. But when we turn on the surface water and riparian area network, you can see the extent to which this network of forest blocks is dependent on this surface water and riparian area network to meet those goals of connectivity. So allowing for wildlife to move up and down along the streams to connect the forest blocks is a huge function here. So one of the ways that I'm talking about the river corridor is seeing it in light of the habitat values, the connectivity values, as well as a host of other ecological values. So we talk about this sort of pattern. One of the new regulations that Vermont towns are dealing with is called Act 171, the Forest Integrity Bill. And it requires towns to identify forest blocks and habitat connectors. And so we have towns identify these large core forest blocks, these anchors of the network. And then we have them identify these smaller stepping stone forest blocks as a type of connector, a stepping stone between the larger anchors. But then on the micro scale, we have them identify these potential wildlife road crossings. And you can see there's just trees on both sides of the road. You don't need to be a rocket scientist to figure out where there are good opportunities for crossing. And then, as I've mentioned several times, that aquatic network, those streamside connectors, the riparian areas, and how important they are as a type of connector. So this is the sort of pattern that we're recommending when we're talking to towns. And this is how we're integrating those concepts of riparian areas into this larger pattern. Now, this also comes up when we talk about wildlife road crossings and the transportation network. And so this is a study from I-89 and Route 2 looking at where wildlife cross those roads. And the darker squares have a higher concentration of tracks per unit of road. And so you can see some of these places where wildlife are crossing. And you can see that in the more developed landscape, those wildlife road crossings really focus on riparian areas. Again, this is a stretch between Bolton and Waterbury, so one of the busiest stretches of I-89. And so there's this real correlation where we can use this infrastructure, the bridges and culverts that pass water under the road system, to potentially also pass wildlife under the road system. And so for some species, our existing network of bridges and culverts are actually working in a whole lot of instances to allow for wildlife passage under the road system. And so here again, we see these multiple benefits of thinking about the larger context of these ecological values. Really what I'm saying here is we can meet multiple goals in the same spot by appropriately sizing our infrastructure. By having good sized bridges and culverts, we're meeting those river corridor demands for improving water quality and river process, but we're also allowing for in-stream movement of fish and other aquatic organisms, and beside the culverts, movement of terrestrial animals like this bobcat. They really don't like to get their feet wet, and even a small few inch wide shelf is sufficient for many of these animals to use the bridge system or the culvert system. We also talk about these issues, the river corridor, in the context of climate resilience and the hazard mitigation planning. And so some of our work really does mix with the state and local hazard mitigation plans. We also talk a lot about this concept and use Vermont conservation design in our technical assistance to municipalities with respect to land use planning. And so here's a natural resources map of Newfane, and it shows you some of the habitat areas that they're most concerned about, the rare, threatened, and endangered species and deer yards. And so this is a very typical way that we interact with towns, is through documents like this. But you'll also see that the river system is just those stream center lines, and we don't actually get to riparian habitat on a map like this. And Newfane is really an excellent town plan with respect to natural resource issues. And yet still we've got some work to do to better recognize these riparian habitats as critically important part of the larger process. Now, I mentioned that my program does offer a variety of resources for towns to help. The document on the left, Conserving Vermont's Natural Heritage, is a framework for thinking about the natural world at that landscape, community, and species scale. Mapping Vermont's Natural Heritage is a guide on how to use BioFinder and Vermont conservation design for land use planning. And then we do have a guidance document on Act 171, that forest integrity bill that I talked about. All right, so that's it for my section. Are there any questions in the chat, Danielle, please?
I don't see any yet.
Okay. Well, folks, no pressure, but you are welcome to ask questions in the chat. We're going to switch over to Danielle's section now, but you can still put questions in there for me, and all three of us will address questions at the end. So I'm going to go ahead and get out, and it's all yours. And you are full screen.
Great. Everybody can hear me, hopefully. All right, so I'm really excited today to talk with everyone and to connect river corridors and wildlife habitat with tactical basin planning. Tactical basin planning, the connection really here is water quality, so that that part of the Vermont conservation design, surface waters and riparian areas, that's what you're going to find connecting to tactical basin plans. So clean water, connectivity, town planning, outdoor recreation, ecological function, riparian areas, biological diversity. These are all words we just heard Jens use while describing the community wildlife program and the work they do in fish and wildlife in cooperation with towns. So here at the Department of Environmental Conservation, where I work, we use those terms carrying out our work around water quality. Water is integral part of our lives, and the goal of tactical basin planning is to protect and restore our surface waters, our rivers, wetlands, lakes, and ponds. This is a shared goal within our agency, which includes the Department of Environmental Conservation, Forest Parks and Recreation, and Fish and Wildlife. And this shared goal results in high quality wildlife habitat and recreation sources in the form of swimming, fishing, and boating within our state, and protection from flood damage, dirty water, and degraded aquatic habitat. Tactical basin planning is a collaborative effort that requires action at all levels, from private landowners, municipalities, watershed groups, regional planning commissions, and our state and federal partners. The work we do here impacts water quality in the Connecticut River to the Long Island Sound, the Hudson River to New York Bay, and the St. Lawrence River via the Richelieu River flowing from Lake Champlain into Canada. So we span a lot, and what we do here affects places outside of Vermont. Some of you may be new to watershed concepts. Some of you, this may be old hat, but a watershed is an area of land that's drained by a river and its tributaries. We use the terms watershed and drainage basin or basin interchangeably, but more accurately, the watershed is the boundary of the drainage basin. For example, the surface area of a bathtub that flows into the drain is the basin, and the edge of the bathtub is the watershed boundary. Basin planning is watershed focused, and 15 major watersheds in Vermont, including the Passumpsic River Basin, the Otter Creek River Basin, the Winooski River Basin, the basins I cover, the Lamoille Basin, the White River Basin, and then the brown one, the Stevens Wells Waits on Pompanusick and Connecticut direct tributary that's in the on the eastern side, centrally in the state, that flows into the Connecticut River. There are 5 watershed planners. The watershed planners collaborate with myriad partners and stakeholders to develop a tactical basin plan for each basin every 5 years. And right now we're working on developing the Lamoille plan and the Winooski plan. Tactical basin plans are strategic guidebooks for achieving watershed health. They identify surface waters that are in need of restoration and protection, and they outline a list of actions to achieve water quality goals. The plans also identify the partners and funding critical to implementing the actions. These plans are developed in accordance with the Vermont Surface Water Management Strategy, which I'm sure you've all read, and the Vermont Water Quality Standards to protect and maintain, enhance, and restore the biological, chemical, and physical integrity of Vermont's water resources. Really what it comes down to is we want our waters to be clean and clear so people can boat and fish and just all out enjoy the waters of the state. The basin planning process includes 5 major steps. They are 1, monitoring water quality, 2, assessing and analyzing that water quality data. And we get it from multiple sources from the state and also from volunteers who collect water quality data throughout the state. 3, identifying strategies and projects to protect and restore surface waters. Then we seek public comment and develop our basin plans. And this is what we do every 5 years. And then, which is ongoing part of our process, is we implement and track our plan priorities. So remember that list I told you about? We have that list that identifies here all the different strategies we're going to do. This is where we're going to do them. These are who our partners are. and this is where we think the funding can come from, and we also include towns in that list, is during that 5-year time, we are implementing those actions and then tracking them so that when the next plan comes up, we can say, this is how much we've completed since the previous plan. And that's what we're doing in the Lamoille right now. In order to implement the strategies identified in our plan, we work in concert with natural resource professional, non-governmental organizations, regional planning commissions, municipalities, planning commissions, and conservation commissions, conservation districts, watershed groups, lake associations, and private landowners. So you can see that we work with everybody who's interested in being part of the process. Sometimes watershed planners work directly with towns, depending on what strategies may be identified in their town. And then in other cases, towns work with our partners or carry out the strategies themselves with technical assistance from the watershed planner. So for example, here are a couple of strategies from the 2018 White River Tactical Basin Plan. Strategy number 40 in the upper left-hand corner is municipal outreach for adoption of river corridor protection identified for 9 towns. So we have the water bodies where this is a focus for, what the purpose of this action is, and that's to establish protections that will reduce water quality impacts from encroachment. So that's building really close to the river and the impacts those may have. So we're talking about new development. We have the towns that are the priorities, who the partners are that might be able to help us carry those out, and then those funding opportunities. So this action is really focused on protecting water bodies and issues in those areas. And then we check on this, and we also have statutory partners, those regional planning commissions, our conservation districts, and then our watershed groups who have a contract with the state to help us carry out those actions. So one of these actions you may have, if you're on a town planning commission or select board, you may have somebody from one of the commissions reach out and say, hey, this is a priority in the Tactical Basin Plan. We want to gauge your interest in carrying out this strategy. Can we work together on this? And so because there's a lot of things that can get done in a basin plan, we really are looking to working with people who are ready to start working on the strategy. Sometimes towns are really not ready or really not in a place that they can carry these out. So we generally will check in with them, get an idea of what their timeline might be, and then check back in when it makes the most sense. So in every plan, it really is a high priority to protect river corridors. That's what we find. If you look in any plan, you're going to find this as a high priority because it really relies on a holistic approach with many benefits beyond just water quality. So all the work that Jens does, protecting those riparian corridors, keeping them open, letting the water be able to move. You have flood protections, you have wildlife protection. It's just one of those places where there's a lot of stuff going on. And by making sure that we're not encroaching on every square inch of that, we are protecting ourselves and saving money in the long run. So other examples of work we carry out with towns are stormwater master plans, tree plantings, installation of green stormwater practices. So that's using plants and other biological materials to treat stormwater runoff. So that's that dirty water that's coming off of roads and parking lots and buildings when we have rainstorms. We also have road erosion projects as well. So these plans that we develop can also be used while developing the natural resources section of a new town plan or like a water quality section in a new town plan, because they identify priorities for restoration and water quality for towns. They also identify high quality rivers, lakes, and wetlands for protection. So they can be utilized when you're working on your updates to your town plans. And I'm always happy to help, and so are the regional planning commissions with that. Now I want to share with you a couple different projects that we've completed to give you an idea of when I'm talking about projects, what am I talking about? And these are specifically related to river corridor protection. The first one that we're looking at, this is in Jeffersonville, Vermont, in the town of Cambridge. And this is a bridge replacement and floodplain restoration project. And this included a collaboration with many partners for funding, and additional projects were identified as this project was happening. And Staci will show you additional information about Jeffersonville during her presentation. So you can see on the upper left-hand slide, there's this really tiny bridge over this big river. So this is where the Brewster River flows into the Lamoille River. And the Lamoille River is the much larger river, like Winooski size, Otter Creek size river. And so when you have flooding events, that water rushes down from the mountain. So that's where Smuggler's Notches and Mount Mansfield area. So all that water is rushing down, and you get these really high flows. And sometimes when the Lamoille is really high, it can even back up into the Brewster River. So having this little constriction in the river can cause real big major flooding issues. And that's what was happening with the town of Jeffersonville. So what they did was we worked with a number of different partners, including Fema, and Fema said, well, we can replace the bridge, right? But we looked at the bridge, the town, the Regional Planning Commission, they looked at the bridge and they said, the bridge isn't big enough. We don't want to just rebuild it the way it was. And so they were able to, through lots of time and process, and now hopefully this is a better process moving forward with FEMA, is get a better bridge installed. So you can see in the upper right-hand corner is the bridge lifted up higher, and then it goes all the way across the floodplain. So now a lot more water can move into that area, and then it can head left in that grassy area into a larger floodplain that used to be, it's still used as agricultural land, but now it has a river corridor easement, which means that they won't manage it to prevent that river from moving and flooding in that area. So now we have all this extra space, and they did a number of other improvements in the town to prevent the flooding. And then that lower left-hand corner picture is a picture where the water flow is really high again, but you can see there's a lot of space for that water to spread out. And then this project, the second one is the Walcott Floodplain Restoration Project. And this project happened when there was a big flood on the Wild Branch in Walcott, and that's relatively close to where it comes into the Lamoille. It's upstream a ways. And in this project, there was a big flood that happened, and the water jumped out and hit a ditch that was on the side of the road, which is basically a flood chute, and it just tore apart this ditch. So you can see on the upper left-hand slide, all the riprap on the side of the road. So that whole road was taken off. The power lines were knocked over. So they've done some fixing of this, some emergency fixing at this point. And what we realized was, well, we could have them just, put up some more riprap and just stabilize that roadside and just leave it at it as is. But that's not going to be good for the river, because the next flood that comes through here is going to pull out all of that really steep bank and deposit it all into the river, and may lead to, water quality issues. So we said, well, hey, we have a good idea. Why don't we smooth out that flood chute a little bit, give it some help, essentially, to help reach a little bit more of an equilibrium. And so we were able to take the dirt from one side of the river, bring it over to the riprap that would have just been left as riprap. We put that dirt there and then did grass seed and then stabilized that side. So now on the right-hand side of the stream, vegetation will grow up where it would have just been rock. And then on the left-hand side, there was a bunch of plantings done there. Right now, you're just looking at it with the grass and the stabilization. So they've done a bunch of plantings. And then when you look at the last picture on the right-hand side, you can see how it's a little bit more stable than what we were looking at in the first slide. So that's what we did in Walcott. And then I want to put a plug in. We do have the Watershed Projects Explorer, and that's a way that as a town you can go visit through the Clean Water portal the projects that may be in your town, and you can search and see which projects have been listed in your town. None of these projects are like shovel ready. You still need to check in and get to the first stage of developing these projects, but they've been identified through assessments and plans. Jens going to put a link to how to use the Project Explorer and how to use our Watershed Projects database. And the link that Jens will share in the chat also has all these other webinars that are less than 20 minutes that are part of the municipal day for related to forestry, fish and wildlife, water quality, and probably some other things like recycling. So check it out, and thanks for your time today. And if anybody has any questions, I guess, Jens, if there's anything in the chat, I'd be happy to answer.
Yeah, there is, Danielle. Thanks. So Simone writes in, what would be good statutory references to include in municipal bylaws for protecting surface waters, riparian buffers, and wetlands. Any other references or resources you'd recommend for this topic? She's the town planner in Milton.
Oh, okay. Can you read it one more time? I'm sorry, Jens. I was like closing things out and I want to make sure I have a good answer.
Sorry to hit you with that. What would be good statutory references to include in municipal bylaws for protecting surface waters, riparian buffers, and wetlands? Are there other resources or references that you'd recommend on the topic?
Yeah, so I think one really good reference, and Staci can speak to this, is the Flood Ready website. And that really focuses on how towns can protect themselves from flooding, but it really like I said, it's kind of this holistic approach that when you start to protect your river corridors, you're actually protecting a whole other host of potential water quality issues, and then habitat. So there's a lot of things that you can probably glean from the Flood Ready website. And then it also has you set up, if you're meeting their standards, to have better funding for if you have flooding events in your town. So making sure you meet those. I would say that, the Basin plan in terms of water quality is a really good place to look. We don't necessarily have, statutory references, but in the plan, we say these are some of the statutory things that you may want to think about in your town plan. And I don't know, Jens, if you and Staci have any other recommendations.
No, that was great. Thank you. Alice writes in, I think this is for me actually, that she got a question from the Duxbury Planning Commission about the importance and value of towns coordinating their Act 171 forest and habitat work to ensure connectivity. And she asks if there are any suggestions on how to best accomplish that. For other towns, I say work with your regional planning commission. Alice, for you, I say work more with the Mad River Valley Planning District. Actually, all of the mapping that I did for you all in Waitsfield, I actually also did on the 5-town scale, including Duxbury and Moortown. So all of that forest block and the new wildlife road crossings data, I've already made available to the Mad River Valley Planning District. So Josh and Corey have that, Corey from Facebook. Anyway, so I can talk more about that with you, Alice, offline. Danielle, for you, Lenny writes in that Act 250 has been issuing land use permits since the early 70s. And there were permits for projects abutting surface waters that have often included conditions requiring undisturbed riparian buffers where no clearing, cutting, vehicle operation, and other disturbances are allowed. Has there been any effort to research all those permits and including the required buffers in the inventory of protected riparian zones?
Yeah, I'm wondering too if this probably fits into your work, Jens, for the conservation design. It's a really interesting question to, I'm totally a map geek. I love looking at maps and, clicking on the different layers and seeing where things are intersecting. And so it would be amazing to be able to actually see where those protected buffers are throughout the state. And I don't know through Act 250 if those are protected in perpetuity, so meaning forever and ever. We do have the river corridor easements that the state has funded, mapped. And then we do have the Fish and Wildlife stream bank parcels mapped. But as far as I know, we don't have the required buffers from Act 250 mapped. I think that, and I don't know how Act 250 actually, I guess, keeps that information, if they actually have a mapping database or if it's all on paper. So it's an interesting question, but no, we haven't done any of that.
Yeah, Lenny, I would suspect very little has happened in that regard since you left the department. But those mapped river corridor easements in the atlas is something new that you might not have seen before. That at least raises the bar a little bit. Okay, no other questions for you, Danielle. Staci, it's all yours.
Hi, I'm Staci Pomeroy. I'm with the one of the 4 regional river scientists for the Vermont Rivers program. And I will talk with you guys today a little bit about river corridors and thinking about how they function in with planning for our flood resiliency. Can folks see my screen okay?
Not yet, Staci.
Oh, sorry. It helps if I actually share the screen. Sorry, I have too many pieces open here. Screen 2. Okay, now can you see my screen?
Yep, you're full screen, ready to go.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. All right, so flooding happens to be Vermont's most common type of natural disaster. And as we look across the state, we can see that Vermont has been hit by many types of flooding disasters almost on a regular, almost yearly in some communities across the state. But we have learned from these tragedies, and it has helped us improve our efforts around flood resiliency and floodplain management. Most of us are familiar with the inundation flooding, that getting your feet wet type of flooding. But we also look at flood erosion, and this can be gradual or catastrophic during a flood. And a stable stream is not a static stream. They will change over time with changes from inputs in our watershed and from our climate changes. Most of Vermont's greatest damage during a flooding is due to erosion. And this is due in part to our geography and our climate, past and historic current settlement patterns, as well as stream alterations, things that we have been doing to try to control our streams. Because Vermont experiences both inundation and erosion during flooding, there is a need to plan for both. Most of us may be familiar with the National Flood Insurance maps. However, they only cover about 20% of Vermont's streams, and they don't represent the true amount of possible flooding on various streams, and or if they've not been mapped, most people don't think that there is a risk. The National Flood Insurance maps are focused on inundation, and so they don't show the potential risk from erosion. And elevation to avoid inundation is often ineffective in protecting the structures from erosion. Many of Vermont's towns have a minimum or no flood hazard regulation that limits or modifies how someone may develop in these areas along our river or our floodplain. And encroachments along the river and in the floodplain are impacted by flooding, but they're also contributing to the issue. So continued development in these areas creates a long-term conflict that requires us to have ongoing channel management. Our cost of flooding to individuals and society is increasing. And for both the individual and the community, receiving funds for recovery can be a long and complex process, and it often takes years between the event and any type of full recovery. Because there is a continued increase in cost and damage in Vermont's community, the legislature took action. Act 110 and Act 130A both focus on protecting the river corridor as a way to reduce damage during flooding and river adjustments. The legislation recognizes the importance of planning for inundation and erosion hazards, as well as providing for valuable water quality and habitat benefits that these areas can provide. We're going to explore a few key features from these acts. So let's look at the river corridor side of reducing risk to flooding. As Danielle mentioned, there's a good website, the Vermont's Flood Ready site, and there's a frequently asked questions page around river corridors. So we'll take a few moments and look at a couple of the highlights from this page. So what are river corridors, and why use them to promote flood resiliency? Because much of Vermont's damage is due to erosion, and our National Flood Insurance maps don't account for this type of damage, we need a different way to look at this type of flooding event and damage. Vermont's river corridors are a minimum meander belt, so how far out does the river move over time, and an additional 50-foot buffer that is needed to allow the river to adjust over time towards a more equilibrium condition, along with meeting those water quality and habitat goals. If we can reduce encroachment in these areas, the impact from flooding over the long term should also be reduced. And I mentioned that there is a 50-foot buffer included in the river corridor, and this is not the same as a town's riparian buffer zone. So let's look at a couple of the differences. A town buffer language may focus on vegetation management. It's typically there for looking at water quality, habitat, and stream stability, and it's typically looking at just the current stream location. The 50-foot buffer in the river corridor is not focused on managing the riparian buffer vegetation itself. It's simply the space to allow for that over time, and it's providing for the current and future buffer needs. And it's also taking the long-term approach for water quality, habitat, and stream stability benefits. We can look at this example on a map. So in the first example, you can see the minimum meander belt width area line drawn on the outer edge of the river meanders. This picture is from the Lamoille River outside of Jeffersonville, and you can see the large old meanders as well as my blue squiggly stream that gives you an idea of how far over time the river has moved. And the second picture, if we look at putting development right at the edge of those outer lines, then there's no room if the stream moves over to that to actually have a good riparian buffer area. The legislation recognized that it's important for us to have space over time as the stream reaches that outer limit of the meander belt width to account for a riparian buffer. So in the last picture, you can see that the yellow lines represent that 50-foot setback for the buffer. And then as the development happens to that line and the stream reaches the outer red line, there's still room to provide for a buffer in that area. The agency provides the river corridor maps for all communities, and the Rivers program has worked over the last several years to make river corridors throughout Vermont for all streams with a watershed size that is greater than 2 square miles, and there's a standard 50-foot setback on streams that are less than or equal to 2 square mile watershed. These maps provide an important tool for understanding the greater risk of erosion during flooding and how they work in with our inundation maps from the National Flood Insurance maps. If we continue to look with communities at both inundation and erosion hazard, we'll have long-term success at reducing our flood damage. Where can we find these maps? The river corridor maps are available on the Agency of Natural Resources Atlas. Where can you find the FEMA maps? In some parts of Vermont, the FEMA maps have been digitized and they are also available on the agency's A&R Atlas. But for other communities, they're still working with paper maps, and the maps are made available at the town office or the Regional Planning Commission, and we can also find them as PDFs on the FEMA flood map page. So where do river corridors get utilized? Act 110 and Act 138 gave the Agency of Natural Resources jurisdiction to regulate the activities in the river corridors through the stream alteration permitting process around bridges, work in and around the streams, Act 250 and Section 248 regulations, as well as in the state flood hazard area and river corridor permit for those projects that are exempt from municipal regulations. The river corridors can also be used to work with municipalities and regional planners for flood resiliency planning in their hazard mitigation plan or town plans and town bylaws. To get started, a community can reach out to their regional river scientist to learn more about the corridors maps in their town. And this happens to be an example from Elmore, where we looked at the E911 sites to understand where there was development already in the river corridor and where there is an ability to reduce risks by protecting the river corridors over the long term to keep development out of those areas that may be in risk. Act 138 also required A&R to develop incentives and education materials for communities to act on flood resiliency. In 2014, changes to the Vermont Emergency Relief Assistance Fund, ERAF, provided incentives for communities to go beyond the minimum. The state match for the public assistance funds from FEMA will increase as the community increases the level of protection standards for flood hazards. We touched on this a little earlier, but also to assist communities and planners, the flood resiliency page was created. By better educating the larger Vermont community about risk around flooding and how they can become more flood resilient, there is a better chance that support will be there for taking action. I encourage you to explore the site if you've not already. The economic benefits of protecting floodplains and river corridors has also been shown in several cases. By ensuring that these economic benefits are also recognized in the planning efforts as a type of green infrastructure that helps protect our communities is key to looking at a larger scale protection and restoration effort. And as Jens mentioned, there are many habitat components and wildlife benefits as well beyond just the economics around the wetland or floodplain protection. I'm going to provide you a couple examples around river corridor protection that's outside of just looking at bylaws or town plans. We can do river corridor and floodplain easements. Danielle mentioned one of the projects in Jeffersonville, and I'm going to touch on another. So the community of Jeffersonville experienced significant flooding in the spring floods of 2011. The yellow box is where there was a proposed and permitted project for development in this area. The community saw the flooding that occurred in 2011, and the amount of water that was in that yellow square would be recognized that if the development occurred in that area, the water would be shifted to other locations in the community, making already vulnerable homes more vulnerable. The community rallied together and raised funds, got grants in order to protect and purchase the development from the developer in order to protect that floodplain for the long term, forever, basically, to provide those floodplain benefits forever. So a huge effort. You can really see how much water and area that area, by being protected, will keep those floodwaters from being transferred to other parts of the community. In the second example, this is of a private landowner where the river had changed locations many times over the last several years and was impacting their farming. We worked with the Vermont Land Trust to get grant funding in order to protect the river corridor and move the farming out of that area, reducing the long-term conflict that the landowner had and allowing for the opportunity of that corridor to develop into a more functioning system with buffers and areas for both corridor protection, but as well as wildlife and other benefits through water quality. So really this is looking at how do we work together to protect floodplains and river corridors. It's a key strategy in increasing Vermont's flood resiliency, as well as meeting some of the other important water quality and ecological goals that both Danielle and Jens has touched on. And that is my end. So I will stop sharing my screen here and see if there are any questions.
Staci, thank you so much. That was very informative and super helpful. And Danielle, thank you. Those were excellent presentations, and I found them really great. Staci, a question from Lenny. How successful have the legislative incentives been in encouraging towns to adopt the high standards for the river corridor concept? The town of Linden just barely revised its zoning bylaws regarding placement of fill to return back language that was more lenient in this regard.
That is a good question, Lenny. I think for some communities who have experienced significant flooding, those incentives can make a real difference when the cost for them for public assistance match is high. For other communities, the incentive has not, because they feel they haven't experienced significant impacts or had a lot of public assistance projects, those incentives may not be as strong to move the needle. I think what I've seen for most communities is it becomes a voice to recognize the current flooding in the community and how do the community members see future impacts. to the community itself. Not so much that the incentive really drives the community to adopt those corridors or not. I'm actually gonna. I see I'm looking sideways. I'm going to change my my video here. So if you see me go out for a minute, I'll be right back.
I'm going to read you another question, Staci, if you're ready. It's from Dan Lee at Lamoille County Conservation District. And the question is, has Forest Service river restoration project on the west branch of the White River contributed to Vermont's river restoration work? The addition of large woody debris and log jams to break up flow is exciting to me.
That's a great question, and it is a really exciting project. I think that project, while initially focused on perhaps habitat, also really focused on river process. So they looked at the structures that were added into the river to help set the river up to have a functioning floodplain. For those of you who may not be familiar with the project, let me just give a brief explanation. After Tropical Storm Irene, there was a section of the river that was extensively gravel mined and used for materials, as well as to try to think about, they were cleaning the river to try to think about reducing flooding. What that did was basically set the river up to be very unstable. It over-widened the river so that when we got low flows, it meant the river was very low, which would make it very difficult for fish. It also meant that it would get really hot. It took out all of the roughness in the river so that velocities would, when the river was high, it would go very quickly because there was nothing to slow the river down in the channel or along the banks. And it disconnected the river from the floodplain because they were digging material out. So the project looked to, one, how to reconnect and stabilize the channel into a good dimensions and shape and size, so that it was stable. When we had low flows, it would have the right amount of flow, and when we had high flows, it was not going to, it would have floodplain connection in order to dissipate some of those energy. And it encouraged wood material and other structures that would help also set up habitat. Those are really expensive projects. And what we've really focused on is making sure that we're doing better education with our municipalities, our road crews, state and municipal road crews, and engineers and contractors who may be out after a flood to reduce the type of damages that really set that channel up after Irene to be unstable, because we don't want to come back and do those large restoration projects because after the flood we destabilized the stream. We're really trying to work with folks and do better education. We do our river and roads training in order to get people better educated about after the flood, what are the right ways of working in the river? If material is going to be removed from the river, how do we do it somewhat sustainably? And how do we make sure that we continue to maintain our habitat in those areas? Because it's better to keep what we have than to have to go back and restore. It's very expensive. I don't know if that answered Dan's question or not, but.
Thanks, Staci. Well, on the subject of education, let's just go to Alice's question. I have a housing group who feels that the Fema maps are wrong along Route 17 in Fayston. That's a rapidly flowing brook. They feel that changing mapping will make it okay for developing. I'm telling them that this isn't the only thing to consider. What's the best way to educate them? Is it the Rivers and Roads training? What other ideas?
So the river and roads training is more focused actually around our kind of infrastructure, or after a flood recovery, how do you recover from a flood? It doesn't focus so much on how a community may use the flood insurance maps or the river corridors for that type of for zoning or planning. What I would say is for that community, if there's kind of questions, is to reach out to the floodplain manager for that region, or the river scientist, and we could do a community education. So look at why there's concerns over those maps, We know from the National Flood Insurance maps that they're very old in some communities, so things may have changed, and we want to look at how those changes have occurred. We also want to make sure that people recognize, and you may have seen the picture in my slide of the houses way up on the tall bank. Those are houses that would never get their feet wet. And yet we saw the river move 20 to 30 feet during a flood event, and suddenly the house is hanging out over the stream bank. So we're trying to also make sure that people don't think that just because you're not mapped in the FEMA map does not mean you are not at risk for flood damage. So the person can reach out to me more specifically if they are looking to, kind of focus in on an area.
Great, thanks so much, Staci. And Grace, an emergency management planner at CVRPC, also wrote in offering help for Alice. So with that, there are no more questions in the chat, but I wanted to again thank the presenters, Staci and Danielle. Those were really excellent presentations, so helpful. Thank you. And I wanted to thank all of you for joining us today, this morning. It's been a real pleasure to have you with us. We have recorded this session, and we will make that available on our resources page, and Andrew will send out those links when we get those recordings posted. So thank you so much for attending, and have a great day, everyone.